Okay, everybody, thank you very much for joining us today, and welcome to our next How to Do Research and Get Published webinar on how to write a paper, qualitative methodology. Today, we're focusing on what it takes to get published in an academic journal, and we'll focus specifically on the topic of qualitative methodology. So first, I want to introduce you to our team. Janet Salmons is a methodologist, academic writer, and artist. She is a research community manager for Sage Publishing's research community on method space. Her areas of interest include emerging research methods and teaching and collaborative learning in the digital age. Her recent books include Doing Qualitative Research Online in 2022, What Kind of a Researcher Are You in 2021, Reframing and Rethinking Collaboration in Higher Education and Beyond with Norelle Lemon in 2021, and also a book on publishing from your doctoral research in 2020. She lives in Boulder, Colorado. Next, Lauren Bauman is an editorial specialist working primarily with social science titles at Sage. She's a former researcher, instructor, and graduate student at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where she earned her MA in political science. We're also joined by Maria K.E. Lehman, a professor at the Department of Applied Statistics and Research Methods at the University of North Carolina in the U.S. Maria has taught writing and representing qualitative research for 20 years and specializes in creating ethical solutions for culturally complex situations, aesthetic representation of research, and advancing ethical research with young children and diverse groups. A graduate of Eastern Mennonite University, she challenges herself to weave aspects of social justice and peace building into her scholarship. She's a frequent contributor of MethodSpace and an author of a number of books, including An Introduction to Qualitative Research in 2024, Writing and Representing Qualitative Research in 2021, and Ethics in Social Science Research in 2017. We're also joined by Tyler Kincaid, a professional research methodologist for over a decade with 4 years of direct experience analyzing complex behavioral health data within the state of New Mexico. Specifically, he has extensive knowledge and experience working with longitudinal Medicaid claims data related to clients with substance use disorders, serious mental illness, and serious emotional disturbances. He's worked with multiple state of New Mexico partners and agencies, and he leads multiple University of New Mexico teams and works with stakeholders to guide state and federal level policy regarding Medicaid services for clients, the expansion of multi-systemic therapy, and analysis of the New Mexico behavioral health workforce. He was a multidisciplinary research methods instructor and consultant, and has experience teaching graduate level courses in qualitative research method, research ethics, and educational ethnography, along with 8 years of experience teaching undergraduate statistical analysis. And last, I'm Sean Scarsbrick, a marketing manager on the author marketing team at Sage. My primary role is to provide support to authors and reviewers as they move through the publishing process, with a particular focus on providing targeted resources to provide support at the appropriate time in the publication process. And I'm based out of New York. Today, as we go, please feel free to submit your questions to our panelists using the Q&A function on your screen. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can, but time constraints will mean that we can't answer every single one. And we'll follow up with everyone after the call with appropriate questions and answers. So to situate us, this chart illustrates a timeline of the typical author journey, moving from the early stages of securing funding and conducting research all the way through the peer review process and publication. Today, we're focusing specifically on qualitative methodology, and we encourage you to go back and watch recordings of other topics that we've covered in this series, including how to write and format a manuscript and how to navigate the peer review process. And with that, I'll be passing over to Janet.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, and welcome also to everyone who is watching the recording. I'm really thrilled to be joined by this terrific panel to look at some of the particular aspects of writing that are associated with qualitative research. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the thought process while you're actually planning, designing, conducting your research, and some of the particulars about dealing with the kinds of sensitive and personal kinds of data that we collect as qualitative researchers. And we'll be leaving lots of time for your questions. So do post those in the Q&A, and feel free to introduce yourself and let us know where you're logging in from. Next. So Um, we want to take a very positive uh, perspective with our presentation here today. And so, Maria, why don't you begin by talking a little bit about your own personal writing development?
Yeah, first off, I wanted to say thank you so much to Sage and to the rest of the panelists for having us and hosting us. It really means a lot to us. And I particularly want to emphasize all the free resources that Sage makes available through the community. So I hope you sign up to that so you're always alerted through them through the newsletter. Uh, I wanted to add to my formal introduction because it can seem like, oh, this person has published these books. They're at this place where, writing works well for them. And it was a hard entry process for me. So I early in my career, so I'm at about 23 years as a professor. I won a teaching award, I think maybe my second year. And I was greeted with people saying, probably joking, but, oh, that's the kiss of death. Those that teach, they can't publish. And you can imagine pre-tenure, that is a really concerning thing to have people say to you. And then it was quite difficult for me to figure out how to take this huge extracts from data and move them into an article. And so what I did is I developed a course called Writing Qualitative Research, and I decided both myself, I told my students I'm struggling with publishing, and my students, we would try and make the process as transparent as possible. And I decided to take that deadly phrase, publish or perish. We so need to get rid of that in higher ed. Higher ed's all about trying to be inclusive, transparent, supportive. We need to get rid of that and flip that instead and say, these are transparent ways to think about publish so you can persevere. And through that course is the way I met Tyler, and we began to work extensively on his dissertation research, which really informed my understandings of reflexivity. So Tyler, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll jump in and add just a smidge to my own introduction, and I think Sean did a good job there. I think there's this publish, the academic world, and then there's writing just in general too. That there's grant writing, there's report writing, there's other things, and they all kind of fit together. I will say that in the getting rid of the perish word, getting onto the preserved word is, I really learned some things from Dr. Lehman about getting your hands wet, getting yourself moving. The qualitative class writing class that she talked about, one of the best things I think that I got out of there was sitting down and taking a 5-minute, Maria, I could be wrong, it was 2 to 5 minutes, something like that, and writing, and just writing. And maybe whatever the prompt is, think outside of your research for 5 minutes. And if it's with a pen and a paper or it's into a Word document, just start writing, just getting something on a page. I sometimes jokingly say, try to write a sentence a day if you're stuck, because that gets you going. You write one sentence, you write two, those kind of things. So,
Tyler, thanks for reminding me about that. We would start the class with tasting a piece of lemon or smelling cinnamon or something like that, and just do a free write for 3 minutes to get our creative juices going again. And of course, as qualitative writers, we pull heavily on the features that literary writers use. And so this can really help stimulate that area of your writing too.
Let's move on to our next slide, John. So you suggested this as a first step for people to get going. Why don't you explain this one?
Yes, so something Janet and I have talked about is this idea of writing the whole way across the research process. And by that, we mean even before the research. So I would suggest that you start to decide to yourself, what way do you like to write? And some people it's digital, some people it's longhand, maybe you like to voice. And the very beginning before the research is just ideas you get like, oh, this will be interesting to research. That would be interesting to research. This is an important topic. So you get this brainstorming list even. So once you get ready to write the very formal article, you need to choose, and this is the number one piece of advice I give that no one follows. You need to choose a mentor article. So think of it as this article is mentoring you. So we often choose a journal we're writing for, and you should. We're writing for a very direct audience, and that will change the way all sorts of things occur, like formatting, voice. But within it, there should be an article that reflects the way you would like your work to be. It doesn't need to be the same topic. It doesn't need to be the same methodology, but it should have about the same amount of data. So maybe they had 10 participants that they interviewed 3 times, and you do also. And so you start to sculpt your entire article to look like this article. This is not plagiaristic in any way. It's form writing. So picture an amazing, famous novelist. The way they became the novelist is by reading and reading and reading novels. This is what informs our writing. And in this case, you're reading and identifying a mentor article. And then the last piece I would really emphasize there is consider forming a writers group. A writers group is a place where you can talk about your ups and downs. They can help you choose mentor articles. They can give you lots of advice. My initial writers group is one of the main reasons I was able to publish my first several articles. And as you go further into your career, you won't need the mentor article as well. But if you don't do that initial research, you could be sending it to a journal that's a big mismatch. Tyler?
I'll sort of piggyback on what Maria had talked about here. I do believe in the mentor article part. I always tell my students and try to remind myself to not reinvent the wheel. You know, look at some format that is familiar to you. Look at presentation that makes sense within the spectrum of your writing. Maria, I really try to, one other thing to piggyback on there too. I think we get too stuck in picking the journal, and it puts you into this box where you're writing for acceptance and you're separating yourself from writing good research. I think a mentor article can help with that. I also think the journal, or I'll go to the journal in a second. The forming a writers group too, for those folks that feel stuck or you really want to get your research out, have somebody look at it. Don't get stuck staring at your own work over and over and over again. That's the importance when it comes to that formal writing group. I also think that it doesn't have to be just a peer. It doesn't have to be somebody that you're in a class with or somebody that's at the same promotion level. Reach out to people that make sense. Reach out to your mentors. Reach out to folks that might think outside the box. I also really suggest people look into a reflexive journal and think about how your interaction with your research is going to impact how you write this.
Mm-hmm.
There is no separation in qualitative research from the researcher and the data. You know, we can't just put this into an Excel sheet and wipe out the names and get rid of identifying markers. You are now part of this data. You are part of the research. So keeping that reflexive journal, and especially to keep that in the moment, because it's so easy to forget, especially when you have 30, 40-minute interviews, not to mention maybe a 2-hour interview. You're not going to remember that emotion that you had or that feeling that you had that connects the reader, ultimately the reader, to the data the way that you were just connected there. So that's my
okay. So we have a couple of tips here. One is finding good examples, and I suggest if people, you know, as you're reading articles, maybe you find one that has, wow, the introduction to this was so clear, or in another one, the figures and the tables really worked. Just start making files of good exemplars. And then these other two, thinking, you know, we've got both the keeping track of your own thoughts in a journal and sharing with others. So let's go on, Sean. So we're mentioning the idea of keeping a journal as you go, and I think we'll kind of weave this into some of our other thoughts as we go forward, unless there's something else you'd like to add to that.
I would like to add just a little bit about the voice to text. So I always kept my researcher journal by word processing in a file. A lot of students keep it long-handed and then they paste in different clip art or do doodles. And when I first interacted with Tyler's research journal years ago when he was a master's student, I said to him, your research journal, so I thought I was reading a file. I said, it just reads so immediate. And he said, oh, well, I'm doing voice to text. At the time, I think you were researching punk rock groups, is that right? And so he had to be on the move. Do you want to add a little bit to that? And so it added this sense of immediacy that I started to call raw reflexivity. Tyler?
Yes, specifically, there was an ethnography on punk rock culture. So I wasn't going to go to some area with a bunch of punk rockers and have my journal and sit down and start taking notes. I don't think that would have been appropriate. But having a cell phone in the era that we're at now and talking into it, that was totally appropriate. I could walk into a corner, I could stand, right where I was, go into the restroom, something like that. And again, get that emotional feel, and really what I think as that raw data. I really like the way Maria put that raw reflexivity. That an hour later, 30 minutes later, especially a day or two later, I wouldn't have that same, that same emotion, that same interaction with the data.
It
Not
also
easy to use.
It also puts the research participants, because we're always using raw transcriptions of their immediate thoughts, at the same, we're being as equally vulnerable. Really fascinating.
Let's go on to our next slide, John. So in kind of building on what we're saying here, I mean, that, your research journal, it's notes to yourself, but at the same time, it's food for thought for future writing. And not everything will be that formal journal article. You also might be writing, say, a post for an academic blog like the SAGE Research Methods community where I work, or you might be writing something for a newsletter in your professional society or something on social media that will draw attention to your more formal work. So, as you're going, thinking about, the questions that you have to explore at each stage of your study, and posing those questions to yourself. Why did I make this decision? Which thing went really well, and which thing was like, oh gosh, I really wish I had taken a different tack. This is just not working. I thought this was going to be great, but I'm, really, I'm having to retrench because, I need to go a different direction. So, keeping track of those experiences as you go will give you something to work with when you come back to your study and start looking for topics you can write about. Let's keep going. So, just, some other questions for, food for thought, as you go through each stage of your study. In other words, we're trying to encourage you to think about writing from the beginning rather than waiting until you have completed the study and then thinking, well, I'm going to write about my findings. That actually the process of your study is also of interest to the scholarly audience. Let's go on to the next one. So here, just, trying to emphasize this point. Anything else that you want to add about this, Maria or Tyler?
Janet, the example I thought of that was the most generative, because certainly all of us have examples of things that we kept good notes on, that kind of thing, and they still haven't gone somewhere. But early in my career, I was invited to submit a handbook chapter, and I received a reject that was startling to me because I had no opportunity to rewrite. So I contacted and said, I spent a lot of time on this. What could I do to rewrite? And they said no. And I have a suspicion it was because it was so critical. Well, I took that piece, and after I got over being really disappointed, because you had to vent, get over your disappointed, I published an article out of it, and then it also became my ethics textbook. So while at the time, and it was pre-tenure when I got the reject, I thought, oh my goodness, this is such a problem for me tenure-wise. That piece was not able to come across during my tenure submission, but it turned into a book. And so I had my copious notes, everything I had done through the whole process. And that's just an example of persevering instead of completely setting it aside and thinking, well, that must have been horrible. This must not have been a good contribution, but to work with it in a generative way that can be impactful beyond just your own work.
Okay, let's move on to another aspect of writing about qualitative research, which is that, as we think about the kinds of data that we collect as qualitative researchers, sometimes we've got some kind of tricky material. We've got sensitive, hot button, controversial issues, and we need to think about how much of that do we want to include? How do we handle those kinds of difficult topics in our writing? So, Tyler, you were going to share some of your experiences with that.
Yeah, I'll jump in and start in the sense that I'm not a counselor, I'm not a psychologist, I'm none of those things. I'm a statistician, a qualitative researcher, a methodologist. But when conducting qualitative research, I have certainly been in a situation, I've researched unhoused populations, vulnerable populations, a lot of harm reduction work, things like that, where the stories that people are telling are sensitive. There are personal matters, there's traumatic events, there are bad words, things like that. So it sometimes takes you back a little bit as a researcher of how do I do this? And I think that's even appropriate for those folks that are, clinicians as well, that are working in clinical settings and researching. What do I do with this data? What I always try to think about is this person, this situation that you're talking about, they are being honest with you. They are sharing this story with you. This is data that they are giving to you to do something with, and changing that data, not reporting it, only picking out pieces that you like, that's not doing justice to the data, and it's also not doing justice to your research. So there's many ways to think about this. When it comes to sensitive matters, we can separate that quote from that individual. We can take out what we would think of more quantitative markers, that we're not just putting people into a cell and putting them under this specific gender orientation or this specific age group or whatever it might be, some racial category, ethnic category. You can separate them from that. You can paraphrase if needed, but I really like to think that it's best to be authentic to the data that you were given. And sometimes I think it's good to just remember in qualitative research that you're challenging, you're challenging systems. You're not just putting out data that you think might be safe, for lack of a better term. This is personal. These are stories. We are getting the 10,000-foot view of a phenomenon with an on-the-ground story, with a one-on-one interaction. Maria, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I would add two things. So it can be as simple and concise as saying, the research participant said this, I think this. So it's clear what you think about, let's say, something that's inflammatory. If it would impact them at all, you think there could be a career impact or something like that, I absolutely agree with Tyler. We, in qualitative, often will have a little vignette or a sketch about the research participant, which would make them slightly more identifiable. Separate those inflammatory, controversial pieces from that. So you don't even, I think about your study with people who are homeless, Tyler. I think we didn't report gender. Isn't that correct? And we gave, they chose their own pseudonyms, but typically we tried to use pseudonyms, like one of them named themselves shopping cart, which we would never do, but they named themselves that. And so we tried to give us pseudonyms that weren't having gender assumptions around them. And so that way, if you ran into someone in the direct community, you won't be guessing or guessing inaccurately that this is the research participant. So there's a lot of little tips you can do. But the number one thing is we still report that data. I agree, Tyler, and we report it in direct quotes as much as possible. It would be awesome if you're in the data at the title. So we have data in the title. We have data right in the very first paragraph. You just keep the readers in the data the whole way through, data in the last closing paragraph.
I think and just to follow up too, thank you, Maria. I think this is where a reflexive journal really helps. You know, have that journal to go back to when you're writing about these personal stories, these sensitive matters, because that's really going to put you in a better place too to understand what that data means. You know, was this something that is important that I have to report? Was this something outside of my research question, outside of the phenomenon, outside of something a theory that I'm trying to ground, or was it something that really matters?
And if the data is really impacting you, there's definitely a small body of literature we're starting to have on researchers being impacted almost through secondary trauma, if you will. So don't forget, I work with my students on how do you do self-care as a researcher so you can have a long and fruitful career. And so that's another thing where the writers group or the critical friends group can be a way to process that informally, or reach out to an advisor or professional care if it becomes an issue for you.
So Lauren, Lauren, can you give us some ideas kind of from the editorial side? We've talked a lot about the researcher side and the writing side, but if we're going to get published in a journal, we need the other side of the story too.
Absolutely. Thank you to my wonderful panelists for giving us lots of wonderful food for thought. I wanted to come in with a few kind of like practical other considerations and tips. I assume most of the people who are here watching live and will be watching the recording eventually want to get their work published in a journal. So here are just a few additional things to consider as you're thinking about how do I write a manuscript and get it submitted and eventually accepted into a journal. So some tips kind of from the publisher's perspective. The first thing to do, or one of the first things to consider, and this is something that Maria talked about as well, is make sure that you really consider what are the journals you want to submit to. Now, that doesn't mean you should get bogged down on submitting just to one journal, right? But if you are interested in a journal, make sure that it's actually the correct fit for your article. There might be a journal that you absolutely adore reading, but maybe it doesn't publish a lot of qualitative research, which is maybe unfortunate, but as you're kind of figuring out the best path, you want to make sure that you're giving the best option, right, for your journal to be published, or for your journal article to be published. So, right, make sure you read those aims and scopes and journal descriptions on the page. This is especially important for, I think, qualitative research, though it's true of any journal article. Pay attention to those word limits, especially if you're incorporating a lot of interview data, right? And you might have really wonderful quotes that you want to include, right? And those are so important, right, to the actual telling, right, of your research article. But there's only so much that you can include, right, which is so difficult, right, to kind of trim down. This is especially, right, where being maybe critical of your own writing, not in a negative way, but thinking critically of like, okay, what is essential to getting my point across, right, for my thesis, right, for my research question, and also relying on your colleagues, your friends, writing groups, where they can point out saying, you know, these are all maybe wonderful quotes or things to include, but, you know, maybe a few things can be slimmed down. So make sure you really consider those, and also think about where things like images, tables, etc. might be useful, different images. Which do come with a word count, right, but can maybe help you in paring down your total number of words as you're looking to fit it best to the journal's full word count. Another thing to keep in your head and be aware of is that more than likely these images, if you have them that are important, right, as part of your work, they'll probably be published in black and white. If it's really essential for them to be published in color, there usually is an additional cost associated with that. So just something to note. And then finally, right, and this again relates to what Maria was saying about having a mentor article, read the articles from that journal, right? That'll be the best way for you to get a sense of, is the way that I write, right? Not saying that you need to necessarily write to that journal, but if the way that you are writing your research doesn't maybe fit with the ones that you're reading, maybe a different journal could be best fit for it. Next, thinking about making sure that your manuscript is ready, a couple things that are particularly important for qualitative research. And this goes to what Maria and Tyler were talking about in the last section, is making sure that you're thinking critically about kind of the ethics of your research. So any studies that involve humans, right, whether that's in a clinical setting or not, will need to go through some sort of international review board. I'm sure all the panelists here have a lot of experience dealing with IRB. So make sure that you have that information ready, because all the journals will require that you have those ethics statements ready, right? So that you can say, I had this reviewed by my institution, my university's research board, to make sure that we know that before any peer reviewers go through it, that proper ethics were followed. And then where it's appropriate and required, make sure, again, this is something that Maria and Tyler are talking about, that anonymizing subjects is important. I've had cases of the journals that I managed before where there's some things that popped up where some individuals were able to be identified. Obviously, that is not something we prefer, and then we have to go back, do retractions, make edits, all that kind of stuff. To really be thoughtful and careful about making sure that where it's needed, that your subjects are anonymized. And the last thing I wanted to point out for an additional consideration, and this is something that you want to consider prior to like maybe getting funding, doing any of your research, it's the idea around pre-registration and registered reports. These are usually things that oftentimes people consider more in the quantitative world, and I think so far that is where it's been used most, but certainly pre-registration and registered reports are absolutely critical as well to qualitative research. In case you haven't heard of these terms before, pre-registration is a practice of formally depositing a study's design in a repository before conducting your scientific research. So if you have maybe a unique qualitative research method that you're doing and you want to secure that somewhere, that's a great way to make sure, right, that you have that information there. And it's a way to kind of ensure peer review and ethics quality, right, for your research. But if you think that you want to do an additional step and you're interested in getting feedback and commentary on your suggested research design, this is where registered reports come in. So it's a way for your manuscripts to be reviewed and quote unquote approved prior to your actual data collection. So it's really helpful in getting maybe additional suggestions, thoughts from your peers around what your research methods might look like. This could be especially important if you're doing something that's maybe new to you or something that's kind of unique and special. These might be especially helpful when you're looking at journals that look at qualitative methodologies, right? So the journals are specific to qualitative methodologies. Lots of benefits, right, in doing these kind of things, not only kind of upholding and caring about the ethics around your research design, but also getting commentary, right, and feedback on it. So especially if you're concerned about what your results might be, right, and you get those quote unquote null results, those those are more likely to happen in quantitative than qualitative work. But you really get kind of the secured and the additional benefit of having people look at your research methods. So know that these are not things just for quantitative work, but also can be really beneficial as you're thinking about what kind of qualitative methodologies that you use. And that's it for me.
Well, Lauren, I think, some of the points that you've made here really, tie in with some of the kind of advice and tips we've tried to offer, because, as you're looking at journals you'd like to submit to, and you're trying to find those excellent kind of what Maria called the mentor articles, the great examples that, you want to, really look up to, having some other qualitative researcher in a writing group or in a kind of research support group, shall we say, can help you to identify, those journals that will be receptive to the kinds of articles that you want to write. So really good points, and your points about the ethics piece, I think, are really critical as well. So very helpful. And I want to just reassure everyone who is here today and those who are watching the recording that in the follow-up email you'll receive after this webinar, we'll include some additional resources and examples and links to some of the things that we've discussed here. So kind of, don't panic. We'll fill in the blanks with those. And one of the other points I want to just make, since, we are here in a SAGE webinar, that we have several journals that are very receptive to qualitative research, journals that focus on the methods. So, looking back at the comments we were making earlier about thinking through your process, what your experience has been, keeping notes about that you can go back. You might not be thinking, oh, well, I'm going to write an article based on things in my research journal, but those, might be some really valuable insights that other qualitative researchers will benefit from. And there are journals that feature those kinds of articles. So, when we send you our follow-up, we'll also give you some links to SAGE journals that you might look at, both to learn more about qualitative research and methods and how people write about it, but also ones that might be more receptive to your submissions. So I think we're going to go to our questions, because we have lots and lots of questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. You will also see some responses by email, because we won't be able to get to everything. And we will also have follow-up posts and links to our resources on the SAGE Research Methods community. So Sean, what do we have?
Thank you very much, Janet. And to everybody in the call, if you have any questions as we continue talking, please do pop them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And if you see any questions in particular that you like and that you would like us to answer, you can like them to upvote them, and I'll look through what has the most upvotes to get started. But to kick us off, I see a number of questions coming through about writing groups, and people are looking for more information about where to get started, whether it's a general writing group or more of a discipline-specific or a subject area-specific writing group. I'm wondering if anybody in the call today has any tips on where to start with that.
Well, I want to just start by saying, because I know that, looking at our audience, we have people from around the world. There's an organization called AuthorAid, and we will include the link. You can just Google it, but we'll include the link in our follow-up. One of the things that they offer journal discussion groups and writing groups, and it's free. Excellent source. So, if you're thinking, well, I don't know anybody, who would be a good writing group partner, that's one place that you can look. What other suggestions do you have, Maria?
Well, that's one of the reasons I love doing these webinars. I just learned something new, and Lauren taught me something new too. So thank you both so much. The most generative for me was, particularly at the dissertation stage, was to meet with other people dissertating, particularly that were more advanced in the process, and we could share back and forth. A lot of times I would do light editing for advanced students while they were helping me think through how to do analysis, for example. However, do avoid that group if it's just a big complaining group. So one of the groups I was in, all people did was complain, and it's not a good use of my time. So it needs to really be a group that's productive, I think. And some of my students have taken that up through the beginning of their career as a professor. But for the administrators and the faculty in the webinar, I've seen a model that one time it was even supported with some small monies, where a very productive research professor would meet several times a month with the new faculty that weren't tenured, and they had a writers group. And so they would all work together on their different writing and help usher the early career people into being able to write more productively. And I thought that was an amazing resource that a university can offer. And then like Janet said, there are groups online. My qualitative Facebook group, which I think is just called Qualitative Researchers, but Sean's going to send out the link to that. We offer spaces where you can just enter and write together, and then set your intentions at the front of the group, and talk about at the end where you got to with that? And I've seen this as becoming increasingly popular, and there's different organizations online that offer these groups where you just enter and you write in a virtual space, almost as a way of accountability.
I'll jump on one last time here too. I was lucky to have good mentors, and I really tried to take this forward into my career. Don't just think, on some level plane that you have to have a writers group that's somebody's in the same area of dissertation with you, or they're the same level of promotion and faculty with you. Go up, go down, talk to your mentors. Good mentors should be people that can, you can bounce ideas off of, that you can work in a writer group. And don't be afraid to reach out to folks that are students, that are other people that are doing different things. That's my thought there too. Don't just get into some, I have to have somebody that is in the same area as me.
I like that you said that, because it reminded me, my first writers group, first year as a professor, it was interdisciplinary. It was just all of us that had come in that year. And so one of the people was a historian. So our writing was quite different.
Yeah, actually, one of the big pieces of advice that I can give that I did when I was in my graduate school studies is actually make sure that you have folks that are reading your research that aren't studying your specific thing, because especially as you're thinking about publishing, right? Your audience, right? If you're publishing in more of a general, your topic, right? A general public health or a general sociology, whatever, you're going to want to make sure that it's understandable, not just to the 5 people who study your very niche thing. Make sure that you have folks that are maybe outside of, doesn't necessarily have to be your subject or your discipline, but like at least who don't study the same exact thing as you. I certainly hope that you have, everyone here has wonderful mentors, but unfortunately that's not true for everyone. So know that there's a lot of wonderful faculty out there that might even not be a part of your institution, that like see if they're willing to support. I've like done some kind of random reaching out because I had connections of like talking and meeting with people. So know that while there certainly are academics who will say no to you, there's a lot of wonderful, really supportive ones as well. So don't be afraid to reach out to folks.
If you don't ask, you won't get a good response. And it may be that you aren't asking someone to read a vast amount of your writing, because most people are probably too busy to do that. However, asking, think through your strategic questions that you would like some feedback on. And, people reach out to me on LinkedIn and ask me questions. I can't become their doctoral supervisor, but I can answer some brief questions. Especially, if you're reading someone's work, we've talked a lot about finding the good examples. Believe me, those people were in your shoes and they spent a lot of time writing that. So, hearing from somebody who found it valuable. I loved your article. I had a question about the way that you framed the methods in this. I really found that I wanted to know more about X. Would you explain that to me? Or why did you choose to introduce the article in the way that you did? Ask them. Believe me, they'll be happy that someone had a thoughtful reading of their article. And then, that can blossom into a friendship or something more. Or perhaps you say, well, I would like the experience of working with someone who is a published writer. Is there a way that I could assist you? In other words, I'm always looking for like, what can you give? If you're asking for something, what is it that you have to give? You're not an expert. You're asking for someone's advice. You're asking for them to, give you a little help. Well, maybe there's something you could do for them. I'd be happy to help you with this part of it. If you would take the time to read some of my work. We have such a global audience here. There are a lot of researchers who would really welcome having the insight from someone from another part of the world. I'd love to share with you what researchers in my community are struggling with. And then I'd also like to ask you for some help. So reach out. I mean, all they can do is say no.
Thank you all. That was a great discussion, and I think very tied in very well with a lot of questions that have been coming through. Another question I wanted to pose to you all was about the topic of sensitive information and sensitive research that you're doing. So a number of people have asked, how do you deal with this? Anything that's sensitive, anything that's inflammatory, how do you note it? Do you make special adjustments or arrangements for that? And I think this ties a lot with Maria and Tyler, what you both discussing during the presentation. So can I pass it over to you to address that question?
Yeah, so first we would want to think about, was the research question about a sensitive topic? So if it is, you would really want to have a plan ahead of time. So you could find out something so sensitive that you actually have to report it. You're designated by law to report it, and you want to know ahead of time who you would report that to. Or it's so sensitive that you have an obligation to alert the person about areas that they could receive counseling from, let's say. So if the research question is about sensitive issues, all that should be laid out ahead of time, and hopefully your research ethics board and the people that mentor you have helped you have those resources ready. Then, of course, we're doing a study and someone just starts to say something really sensitive to you. I think of an early example here where I was contacted. I was an IRB chair, a research ethics board chair for about 16 years, I think. And I was contacted because while the person was talking, they suddenly said that they were not a documented citizen. And so that wasn't necessarily the research topic, but the researcher was saying, what do I need to do with this data? And so then I walked them through the steps for what we did with that data. And in that case, you would have to think that through within your context, but within our context, we immediately destroyed the signed consent form and got rid of any evidence that the person's legal name was linked with their status within the data. And we moved to a verbal consent, which is something we can do in the United States if someone's talking about something that is considered illegal and would have a direct repercussion to them. You can do a verbal consent or consent around like someone else, two people are there to document the verbal consent, like a co-researcher. So those are some examples I think of there. Within the actual data presentation, and I know we have the whole world here listening, but within the United States aesthetic, we have the actual data that's sensitive, including, let's say they use tons of vulgar or curse words. We would have that word there. If they do it all the time, maybe we would tone it down and not have it as often, because we're not writing for a general newspaper audience. We're writing to other scholars. This is the way the person conveys who they are. So you have anything from vulgarities to things that could have massive repercussions on someone legally, falls into this area of sensitive.
I'll jump in there. When Maria and when I was really in the depths of my qualitative research and really working with vulnerable populations, and we were teaching an ethics class, I really got to the point where I think I wrote this in many things, that when you're doing qualitative research, every interview is potentially vulnerable and potentially sensitive, and you just don't know. You might think that you're going, as Maria said, you know, my research question is about trauma. I know that this is going to be something that is potentially sensitive. And if it's not, then I've done something wrong with my interview, setting that up. But you don't know what you might encounter. There can be triggering questions that become potentially sensitive and vulnerable when you didn't even know that. The biggest part, I think, for the researchers here is to remember, and I don't know if we said this specifically, you know, there is no anonymity in this research. You are part of this research when you're in qualitative research. It's all about the confidentiality and how you are sharing things. I think I'll share one example to circle back to the reflexive journal. Sometimes I think it can help to share the researcher's perspective of something vulnerable rather than just what's happening to this individual that you're in. Unless it is on track, absolutely, to the salient issue of your research question that you need to share, the interaction, the reflective piece of it as a researcher and how that maybe impacts the larger story not just this one situation. If you can share that, that can help as well too. I have that happen as a non-clinical person, where folks have for lack of a better term, they've just broken down in front of me, and I didn't know how to interact with that. That wasn't part of my research, but my interaction within that in a methodological perspective, sharing that I think helped.
Great, thank you both. I see a question that came up that I think is a really interesting one for us to talk about. And it's the question about what happens when your study and your results prove your theory differently. So if you set off with an underlying theory and it doesn't match what happens in your field observation, what do you do? How do you justify that within your writing?
Boy, that is very tricky. If you're going to have this huge mismatch, I just have to be frank and say, I think it's more difficult to publish. I think we would all want to say, oh, that should be publishable, but I wouldn't say that's my personal experience. But there are theories that are intimately who we are. And if that's what the theory is, so let's say you were using a feminist theory, that cannot necessarily be changed. I remember early in my career, a peer reviewer said to a student when they sent an article in, they said, you need to frame this in feminism. As much as I would have liked the young woman to be a feminist, she said she wasn't. She can't do that. That's an identity theory. She can't just frame it in feminism to get it published. She had to send it to a different journal. But if the theory is what we would consider more of a small t theory, so it's not necessarily representative completely of the way you think of the world epistemologically, for example. So maybe it's a working kind of theory, a way people learn something. Then I think that you could change theories. That's one thing about qualitative that's quite different than quantitative. It's organic. So even thinking of my dissertation question, it was caring teacher-child interactions. How did they change over time? After I'd been there for a whole semester, I thought, I haven't spent enough time. So I talked to my committee and we just took the latter part of the question off. We got rid of the over time. And so that, if you're coming from a quantitative perspective, you say you changed your research question. That's a very different thing than in qualitative. It's an organic process that within this writers group, if you craft it more like a critical friends group, and critical friends is considered a #1 strategy from a critical perspective to enhance the trustworthiness of a study, you can dialogue with them about this mismatch and think about what's the best way to proceed. And I don't have super good advice because I don't have enough details, but that's my thoughts overall. What would you add to that, Tyler? That's a tough one.
So I would add, as somebody that I'm not a mixed methodologist, I like everything, but when I really sometimes qualitative research is building a research question, is building the theory. If that's the situation, maybe I know time and money wise, you want to publish and work with what the data that you have. Maybe that's what's happening, is that you're writing about how this has changed the question now for the next study. And that one can just be tricky. I would really lean on what Maria said, that, we have this is not a hard science, if you will, when it comes to qualitative research. We have the ability to change perspectives. We have the ability to change theories. So maybe that's what you're writing about now. Maybe it's not as specific to whatever the phenomenon was that you were studying. Now it's about the methodology and how that has changed your research question.
Thank you both. I think we're going to wrap up with one final question now, and this is a bit of an ethical question. So if you are conducting an interview with somebody and you finish the interview, you hit stop record, and then suddenly they continue to talk and they continue to say something that could impact your results and your findings, but you can't start the recording again. What do you do? Any tips, any suggestions there?
I love this question because in my training, I wish I could cite who it would have been from, but this was called a threshold conversation. I'm sure that's out of ethnography. So if you think of that old English term of a threshold, it is someone standing on your stoop or your doorway. And so I was actually trained to walk out of the door holding the recorder the whole way to my car in case this would occur. Because there's this phenomena when you cut the recording off, people will actually synthesize their entire interview and say, well, so anyways, this is what that meant. And you're sitting there just jaw dropped the first time it happens, your recorder's cut off. Then the other piece they do that makes it an ethical issue, as Sean was noting, is they'll say, and I also wanted to say this. So they're saying it because the recorder's cut off. In that case, you can definitely say, can I cut the recorder back on? If it's the ethical one, they might not want you to. You can email them back and say, you know, you said this and this, and I found it very pertinent and important to the study. Can I use that? But the thing that you definitely do as soon as you get out to your car or get separated from the person, pull around the block and park somewhere and take what ethnography calls head notes. And you can quote that. You can find it in books like from Emerson. Head notes are something you heard and you're writing it down as fast as you can. So we've become so reliant on this technology, we're forgetting all the years we did research where we couldn't have recorded it. So that writing that down by hand, you can still use that in your research. But I personally would always want to relationally go back and ask the person, because there's something about that recording that they feel like they're now off record.
I couldn't have answered that better, Maria. I'll plug, but I'm a reflexivity person. Like Maria said, you know, if that interaction, trustworthiness wise, you should go back to your participant and make sure that what they told you was what they meant to tell you anyway. But in the sense of you being part of this research, get it out. That's something that if you wait, as Maria said with the head note, if you wait, you know, till you drive home or the next day or what, oh, you know, over the weekend, you're not going to remember that. So think of qualitative research in the holistic sense that, you know, you're understanding this person, this situation, this story, this phenomenon, whatever it is, and put all those pieces together.
Great.
Such a
Thank you
good
both.
question.
Thank you
Yeah.
both very much. And with that, I want to introduce and wrap up a little bit today to say that while this is the end of today's webinar, we do have more upcoming. So April 3rd will be our next webinar on quantitative methodology. So anybody looking forward to learning about that, please do join us then. Some other webinars we have on May 7th, we'll have one about how to conduct research in a digital world. And then at the end of June, one about writing your article's front matter. To wrap this up, I want to...
And Sean, can we also plug, they'll have to go even farther ahead because there have been several people who've asked about mixed methods. And you're in luck because we have some fabulous people in August for that webinar. So we will include those links in the follow-up email.
Correct. Yes. Looking forward to that one as well. We have our journal author resources, which you've got up here. I will send a link to this as well. If you need help at any process, any point of the publication process, this is a great spot to start with. Information about how to get published, answering typical author questions, and we do have a Chinese author version as well. Some other things to note as well that I will follow up with everybody who registered for today with a link to the recording. Anybody who attended live will get the presentation, the slides, and also a certificate of attendance. So do be on the lookout for that. And one last note, separate from this webinar, is that at Sage, we have another webinar series called How to Be a Peer Reviewer. And we have one scheduled for the end of March. So please, if you're interested in getting started as a peer reviewer or looking to learn new skills as a peer reviewer, be on the lookout for that one as well. So I want to wrap it up and say a huge thank you to everybody who attended today. Thank you for joining us. And then also very big thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to Maria and Tyler for joining us. And of course, to Janet and Lauren for their expertise in everything today. So again, thank you so much for joining, and we do hope to see you in a future webinar, and take care.